All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen and students, to our first lecture of the distance learning edition of this course in 2020. So this is week 9, lecture 1, and in this week we are talking about authority in Sunni Islam. And in this lecture, we will talk about the institution of the Caliphate within the context of the Sunni tradition of Islam. I'm Dr. Khalil Andani, and I hope you're able to watch and hopefully enjoy this lecture in your own home at your convenience. So let's get started. So in today's lecture, which I hope won't be too long, we'll quickly review the scope and nature of Prophet Muhammad's authority. We'll look at what happened after the death of Prophet Muhammad. We'll try to understand the origins of the Caliphate, get a sense of the different ideas of what the Caliphate is and what is the nature and function of the Caliph or the Caliph. And we'll get a sense of the different caliphates, Sunni and Shia, that existed throughout history. So some of you will remember this sort of list that you see here. This is a summary of what the Quran says about Prophet Muhammad. And for some of the details on this, you can go back to the prior lecture slides. You could also go to some of the in-class work that we did when we talked about the authority of the Prophet Muhammad. Another way of thinking about Prophet Muhammad's authority is in this idea that, again, we can summarize what the Quran says about Muhammad here. So Muhammad holds authority on God's behalf. So you could say he's God's deputy. Obeying Muhammad is obeying God. Muhammad would command and forbid on behalf of God. He was also an intercessor. He was seen as a holy person. One would have to seek God's forgiveness through Muhammad, right? One had to go to the presence of Muhammad, ask God's forgiveness. Muhammad had to pray for the person's forgiveness, and that's how somebody would be forgiven of their sins. Muhammad was also a teacher and a guide, so his role is not just to deliver scripture or simply recite the Quran. Muhammad is the one who interpreted the Quran. He gave guidance to his community in various situations and contexts. So Max Weber was a European scholar, very famous European scholar. He has sort of laid out 3 different kinds of authority. He calls these 3 modes of authority, 3 types: legal rational authority, traditional authority, and charismatic authority. In a sense, Prophet Muhammad fused all 3 of these ideas of authority together. He sort of was a lawgiver in his own time. He also rooted himself in pre-existing Arabian tradition. But probably most of all, Prophet Muhammad's authority was essentially charismatic, right? It's the idea that Muhammad is a divinely inspired, divinely guided person. That's really the source of his authority, what Max Weber calls charisma or grace. So Max Weber, as the scholar Takim has written about it in another book, the notion of charismatic authority means that the leader, in this case Muhammad, has the divine force of charisma. Muhammad is the recipient of divine grace that endows Muhammad with certain, you could say, charismatic traits or spiritual characteristics. And ultimately, the source of Muhammad's authority and different rules is God's guidance, God's inspiration. You could say, God's blessing and grace upon him. And you could imagine that when Muhammad dies, this would leave a huge vacuum of authority within his community. And over time, what will happen is that Muslims will interpret and come up with different models of post-prophetic authority. So different institutions of authority will develop within the first, 4 or 5 centuries. Those institutions include the Sunni scholars called the ulama, the Sufi masters, the Shi'i imams, messianic figures, and the caliphate, or caliphates to be exact. So different institutions of authority will develop in the wake of Muhammad's death. It's very different from Christianity, right? There's no papacy. None of these institutions can claim a monopoly over the others. None of these post-Muhammadan institutions can claim anything like the papacy. Um, so what you have is sort of multiple diverse competing modes of authority. And certainly for their own communities, for their own partisans, many of these authorities do have an absolute claim that's accepted. But overall, when you look at the Muslim world over history, no one of these institutions has actually dominated everybody. So it's important to then understand what the different institutions of authority are in Islamic history and what the basis of their claims are. So today we'll be looking really at the Caliphate, or in Arabic, the Khilafah. The second lecture of this week will be looking at the Sunni scholars. They're called the ulama. Next week, then, we'll be looking at the Shi'i imamate, and then in the week after that, we're looking at Sufi authority. So eventually, we'll look at all of these. So, Sunni beliefs about the succession to Muhammad. And the Sunni beliefs on sort of who succeeded Muhammad and who the legitimate successors of Muhammad are took about 3 or 4 centuries to develop. They didn't develop right after Muhammad died. But the Sunni position eventually would become as follows. Prophet Muhammad had religious, spiritual authority as well as political authority, but Muhammad did not appoint a successor. The Sunnis believe that Muhammad did not designate anybody to take over before he died. Therefore, the Sunnis generally believe that the Muslim community has the authority to select a leader, later will be called the Caliph, by a process of consultation of some sort. The Sunnis, by the 10th century, resolved that the first 4 caliphs after Muhammad were the rightly guided ones. And you'll see very quickly what that means. So what actually happened after the death of Prophet Muhammad? Now, this is a very controversial topic. There are, of course, many interpretations about what should have happened after his death. There's many interpretations on why things happened after his death. There does seem to be some general agreement, though, on what happened. There's some agreement. So after Muhammad died, I think this happened just hours after he died, a group of the Meccans, who are called the Muhajirs or the Muhajirun, right? These are the people from Mecca who emigrated to Medina, and a group of Medinans known as the Ansar. They met and actually had an extended argument about who should be the new leader, and they met at a place called Saqila. This refers to a place of meeting, and they had they had a debate, and we'll look into the details in just a moment. But the outcome of this argument was, and it was not a big group, it was a small group of people, but the outcome was that this small group of people at the assembly, at the meeting, agreed to follow Abu Bakr, who was an elder companion of Muhammad and Muhammad's father-in-law. So Muhammad was married to Aisha. One of Muhammad's wife is Aisha. She's the daughter of Abu Bakr. So this group decided to follow Abu Bakr as the successor or caliph or khalifa to Muhammad. Muhammad's family members were not present at the meeting. This is very significant. There's a lot of evidence that Muhammad's family members were not at the meeting because they were washing Muhammad's body, as you would do in those at that time. They're washing Muhammad's body, preparing it for burial. So they were not there. Um, and the fact that this meeting took place before Muhammad was even buried tells you that the succession to Muhammad must have been an issue even before he died, and it was obviously a very seen as a very critical issue by people in the community. So after the meeting, then I think it was the next day, according to most narratives, everyone in the community, this early community, was summoned to give their oath of allegiance to Abu Bakr, and a lot of pressure was put on people to basically fall in line and accept Abu Bakr as the first successor or caliph to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, Muhammad had said during his lifetime that there will be no more prophets after him. So there was never a question about Abu Bakr being the next prophet. And he didn't call himself that, but he called himself a Khalifa or a Caliph, a successor to Muhammad. So what happened at this meeting? And we have many accounts of it. There's a 8th century, 8th, 9th century account. This is a 10th century account of the meeting. Generally, they're consistent. So here's what happened. So it is said that the Medinan Ansar, so the Medinan followers of Muhammad, they met to choose their own leader. And three members of the Meccan emigrants, the Muhajirun, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Abu Ubaidah, they heard about this meeting, and they actually sort of intervened and they interrupted the meeting. And they argued that whoever the next leader was, that person should come from the tribe of the Quraysh. The Quraysh is the tribe that Muhammad comes from. And the argument they gave was that the Quraysh are closest to Muhammad in lineage, and that the Ansar are not related to Muhammad. So Abu Bakr actually makes a speech, and he nominates Umar or Abu Ubaidah as the leader. Some people who are at the meeting said they would only support Ali. Ali is Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, and as we'll see later, Shia Muslims believe that Ali was the legitimate successor to Muhammad by divine right and by Muhammad's own appointment. So some people would only support Ali. They said they left the meeting. And then there was a big argument, lots of shouting, and Omar, who would later become the second caliph, he narrates, according as related by the 10th century historian Tabari. So Omar said that voices rose and clamorous speech waxed hotter, and I feared total disagreement. So this is Omar talking, I said to Abu Bakr, stretch out your hand so that I may give you the oath of allegiance. He did so, and I gave him the oath of allegiance. The Muhajirun followed, and then the Ansar. In so doing, we jumped on Sa'd ibn Ubadah. So someone said that we had killed him. I said, may God kill him. By God, nothing was mightier than the rendering of the oath of allegiance to Abu Bakr. So this is very interesting in this account where Umar is telling us what happened here, and it's like in the midst of commotion that he just gave allegiance to Abu Bakr in front of everybody, and it seems that everybody else was sort of pressured to follow suit. And it's possible that there was violence. Some people were compelled with violence, and this figure, Sa'ad ibn Ubadah, was killed in what happened. Maybe he refused allegiance. We're not sure, but this seems to be a messy process, basically. This is not a very orderly thing. But at the end of the day, Abu Bakr becomes the caliph, the successor to Muhammad. And so he's seen as the first one. And 2 years later, he passed away. And interestingly, when he died, he appointed Umar. So you recall, Omar nominated Abu Bakr to be the first caliph, and then Abu Bakr nominated Omar to be the second caliph. So you could say they sort of appointed one another. Before Omar died, 10 years later, he appointed a committee to select the third caliph, and they chose Uthman as the third caliph. Uthman was assassinated, and after that, many in the community asked Ali Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, to be the fourth caliph. Ali was assassinated, and his son was the fifth caliph for a very short period of a few months. After Hassan, basically the caliphate or the khilafah from that time, so this office of authority, was basically seized through political and military means by dynastic families. The first family then who basically seized the caliphate or the caliphate were the Umayyads. So from 661 really to 750, and then after that, they are defeated by another family known as the Abbasids. We'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. The Umayyads, some of the Umayyads fled to Spain, so they sort of continue there, but the Abbasids are ruling. And then contemporary with the Abbasids, you have the Fatimids. Now, the Fatimids are interesting because they are actually a Shia. They're not a Sunni caliphate. They're a Shia caliphate. And the Fatimids are descendants of Ali, right? And they're descendants of Muhammad. So they're a unique case in this. And then you have some form of the Abbasid Caliphate continued in Egypt under the Mamluks, and then you have the Ottomans. So this is, in summary, like the different caliphates in Islamic history. If you go back just to the beginning of this, the Shia-Sunni division sort of goes back to really what happens after Muhammad. So the Sunnis will accept Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, the first four, as sort of rightly guided caliphs or rightly guided khulafa. What the term is called the Rashidun. Rashidun means rightly guided. Now, Sunnis will look back and say these four are the rightly guided. Shia Muslims do not even think the office of caliph is legitimate. For Shia Muslims, and we're talking about this next week in more detail, but for Shia Muslims, Muhammad appointed Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, as his successor by divine right, and then Ali appointed his sons Hassan and Hussein to be the successors after him. And the Shias don't refer to them as caliphs, they refer to them as imams. And the point here is that for the Sunnis, the caliph or the caliphate has to have political power, right? It has to rule over a state of some sort. For the Shia, the imam is primarily a religious, spiritual leader, so political power is not necessary. So for the Shia Muslims follow the religious leadership of imams. The Sunnis, on the other hand, recognize the religio-political leadership of the caliphs. They see the first four as rightly guided, but they do recognize the authority of the caliphs after the first four. The Sunnis do. Now, the caliph, for all intents and purposes, he was ruling a Muslim empire, an expanding Muslim empire. And in the period of the first four caliphs, called the Rashidun, there is military expansion. That's this color over here, right? Where during this time, the Muslim empire starts here with Muhammad and expands into Iraq and Iran and Persia, a little bit of North Africa, Egypt. Then with the Umayyads, there's even more expansion. It expands into Central Asia, more of North Africa, and Spain. So these caliphates are empires, basically. And the Umayyads then are defeated, and in the 800s, you have the Abbasids. That's their territory in the 9th century. It's in the green here, right? So they're now ruling, some of like Egypt, Middle East, Persia. You have other dynasties who are ruling other areas. Some of these dynasties, the Tahirids, the Aghlabids, are under Abbasid authority, but they're different color. So this is the Abbasids, and this is when the Abbasids are at their strongest, you could say. The Umayyads are in Spain. Some of the Umayyads escaped to Spain. So then in the year 1000, by the year 1000, things have changed. What's happened now is The Abbasids exist, the caliphs exist, but a Shiite family called the Buyids effectively have taken over. So the Abbasid Caliph is there, but he is a figurehead. He could say he's a puppet. And the Shiite or Shi'i Buyid family, they're called themselves the Amirs. They are the controllers. So that's what you see here. Over here, the Buyids. Another caliphate has risen. These are the Fatimids. They start in 909. They're ruling by year 1000. They're basically North Africa, Egypt, and they're in Arabia as well. Then you have these other dynasties as well. The Umayyads are in Spain. To give you some perspective, this diagram over here, what you see is how the Abbasid caliphs, they are descended from Abbas, who's an uncle of Prophet Muhammad. The Fatimid caliphs are actually descended from Prophet Muhammad because they are the descendants of the children of Ali and Fatima. Fatima is Muhammad's daughter. So the Fatimid caliphs call themselves the Fatimids because they come from Fatima. Fatima is Prophet Muhammad's daughter. So the Fatimids basically have the strongest claim to kinship with Muhammad. They are the descendants of Muhammad. The Abbasids are really at best the descendants of Muhammad's cousin. And then you have these other sort of dynasties who claim descent from Muhammad in other lines. But they don't, these dynasties here, they don't claim to be caliphs. The Fatimids claim to be caliphs. So overall, at one point in history, you had three caliphates. Three competing caliphates, right? The Umayyads in Spain, the Fatimids in North Africa, Egypt, and parts of Arabia, and then the Abbasids in Persia and Iraq, some Central Asia as well. Eventually, though, by the year 1094, you can see the Fatimids have sort of been reduced in how much territory they have. You have these other dynasties in North Africa. You also have another dynasty called the Seljuks. This is a Turkic dynasty from Central Asia. They have conquered the Abbasid territory, and now they are you could say, the rulers over the Abbasids. And the Seljuks call themselves, the leader of the Seljuk has the title of Sultan. So there's a Sultan and there's a Caliph. The Abbasid Caliph at this time in 1094 doesn't really have much power. You could say he has soft power. He doesn't have hard power. The Seljuks have the hard power. This is all important because in theory, the Caliph is the religious and political head of Muslim territories, but in practice, it really didn't work like that. And what you end up happening is really the Caliphate or the Caliphates have to sort of negotiate different types of powers with different parties. In this case, the Abbasid Caliph and the Seljuks, they're coexisting, and there's, the Seljuks really have the political power. So let's talk a little bit about the theory of this. So that was just an overview of the political history of the Caliphate. It was a very scant overview. But let's talk about the theory of the Caliphate. So the word Caliph or Khalifa in the Quran, it could mean successor. It also means God's deputy, the way the word is used in the Quran. And what we seem to have is different caliphs and different caliphates seem to conceive the status of the caliph differently. So if we go back to Abu Bakr, if we can trust what is reported of what he said, he saw himself as a fallible leader, a fallible follower of Muhammad. You can get that from his statement here. He says Muhammad was protected from evil, but he's only a follower of Muhammad. And Abu Bakr basically says, if I'm doing the right thing, follow me. And if I'm not doing the right thing, then you should correct me. So Abu Bakr he's the first caliph. He seems to have a rather modest view of the position that he has. The third caliph, Uthman comes from a different family. He actually comes from the Umayyad family. Uthman referred to himself as God's deputy. Abu Bakr called himself the successor or the deputy of Muhammad, but Uthman saw himself as the deputy of God. He even once said that the caliph is a shirt that the Almighty has placed on him and that he would never give it up. So Uthman had a different view of the status of the caliph. The Umayyad caliphs, who again, same family as Uthman, the Umayyads saw the caliph, of which they are, as God's deputy on earth. They believe that the caliphs are infallible. They're immune from error. They are appointed by God. They're chosen by God. Obeying the caliph, according to the Umayyads, is part of faith. Some Umayyad, it is suggested, some of the Umayyad caliphs believed they were greater than the prophets. And the Umayyads believed that the Umayyad caliph can prescribe authoritative traditions, basically. So the Umayyad caliph, in a sense, can make law to a certain degree. This view of the caliph would continue even among the Abbasids. So the Abbasids saw themselves as God's deputy and Muhammad's deputies. They called themselves the shadow of God on earth. The Abbasid caliphs saw themselves as leaders, as guides who are guided by God, as the manifestation of God's justice, the interpreters of the law, the interpreters of theology. That's how the Abbasids saw themselves. So in general, you could say that the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs had a very high view of themselves. Again, I'm just limiting myself to the Sunni context. So the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs saw themselves as political and spiritual leaders, and their supporters, so the people in their court who are writing poems about them and stuff, performing for them, they saw the Abbasids as political and spiritual leaders. Some of the Sunni scholars also put forward some theories of who the caliph is. So there's al-Mawardi. He's in the 11th century. He's a chief judge or qadi under the Abbasids. He saw the caliph as the deputy of God's messenger, not the deputy of God. He believed that the caliph or the caliph had to possess a number of qualities, which I've listed here. For example, the caliph has to be from the tribe of the Quraysh, for example. The caliph is the guardian of the Islamic community, the public order. He has to be obeyed. He enforces the laws. The caliph has to be chosen by the Muslim community, Mawardi says, but that's, again, it's not very clear what that even means. At one point he says even 5 people or 6 people could choose the caliph. So it's not very clear how that's supposed to work, but that's what consultation would mean. Now, in actual practice, and I've already mentioned this, the Abbasid caliphs, although they may claim to be religious and political leaders, in many, many cases, they found themselves as simple figureheads, and the political power was held by other parties, the Buyids in the 10th century, the Seljuks in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Mamluks in the 13th century onward. So quite often, the caliph had to be okay with soft power, possessing soft power as sort of like a figurehead, a symbol, as opposed to someone who really had political power. Even the religious authority of the Abbasid caliphs was contested by other parties. So the Abbasid caliphs, even if they claim religious authority, there are other Muslim institutions or groups that are claiming religious authorities. The Sunni scholars claim religious authority. The Sufi masters claim religious authority. The Shi'i imams claim religious authority at the same time. So all types of authority in Muslim history, even the authority of the caliphs was being contested all the time. The Sunni scholar al-Ghazali also offered his own theory of the caliphate. Now, of course, he works for the Abbasids too. So he sees the caliph as God's deputy. And when Ghazali was writing about this, he was working for the Abbasids and he was writing against the Fatimids. So if we go back to some of our maps, so it's around this time, al-Ghazali is in Baghdad, and the Fatimids, they are a Shi'i caliphate in Egypt, and he is writing to support the Abbasid Caliphate against the Fatimids, right? So that's what al-Ghazali is doing. So he's offering a theory of the Caliphate, but he has a very political purpose in mind. Um, he does not believe the Caliph has all religious authority. He believes the Sunni scholars have religious authority, but they are there to advise the Caliph. And Ghazali believes that the Caliph is fallible, right? He's not infallible. And of course, he has to possess certain, 10 qualities. According to one scholar, a friend of mine, Han Xian, he writes that al-Ghazali's Caliph is no more than a religious figurehead or symbol. The reason is because when al-Ghazali is alive, the Seljuk sultans, they have the power. They have the military. They have the political power. And the Abbasid Caliph in the 1090s doesn't really have hard power. He doesn't have military might. So this just goes to show that even the theories of what a caliph is and what power a caliph has had to be adjusted and accommodated to the actual political situation on the ground. Now, in 1258, the Mongols invaded the Abbasid territory. They invaded a lot of the Muslim world. They killed the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. They put an end to the Baghdad Abbasids. A few members of the Abbasid family found refuge in Egypt, which at that time was being ruled by the Mamluks. And the Mamluks installed members of this family as caliphs, but they were puppet caliphs. The Mamluk dynasty, who they called themselves sultans, they were in charge during this time. In 1517, another sultan dynasty, the Ottomans, they defeat the Mamluks. They took the Abbasid Caliph prisoner, and then after that, the Ottoman sultans claimed to be the caliphs of Sunni Islam. So now you have the Ottoman Caliphate. And in the 16th century, Ottoman scholars portrayed their caliph as the shadow of God and the friend of God. They started talking about the status of the Ottoman caliph in mystical terms, in a sense, in very sort of spiritual terms. They drew on a lot of Sufi ideas to make these claims. But in World War I, the Ottoman Empire basically picked the wrong side. They were allied with the Germans, and they were defeated in World War I. And in 1924, the Ottoman Caliphate was abolished. So in these pictures here, what you have here, this figure here, this is Sultan Abdul Hamid. He died in 1918. He was the Ottoman Caliph during World War I, right? And his success after him, there were a couple more caliphs, but you had the last Ottoman Caliph was Sultan Abdul Majid. He is pictured here, and this is a portrait of all the Ottoman caliphs from the beginning. But in 1924, and this is sort of like, I guess, a news cutting from that time. In 1924, the Turkish parliament, you could say, abolished the Ottoman Caliphate. So that was the end. Sultan Abdul Majid, he was the last caliph, and basically the Sunni Caliphate comes to an end in 1924. And today there is no caliphate. The main political entity today, even for Sunnis, is like for all of us, the nation state. So that's just sort of my very quick lecture on the overview of the history and status of the caliph in Sunni Islam. So if we just go back to the objectives, this is what we were trying to achieve today. And again, the caliphate, for all that it is, historically, is just one institution of post-prophetic authority. And in the next lecture for this week, lecture number 2, we will look at the authority of the Sunni scholars, which actually, from a contemporary perspective, is far more relevant in a sense. So that's all for this lecture. Again, don't forget to do your lecture self-reviews based on both lectures. If you have any questions about this, you can pose them there. You'll get a copy of these slides. So if there's anything you missed, you can take a look. So that's all, and stay tuned for the next lecture of the week. Thank you all, and have a good evening.